The harsh Montana winter had finally released its grip on the Blackwater Valley, leaving behind a ranch in desperate need of renewal. Caleb Morgan stood on the weathered porch of his father's homestead, squinting against the early morning sun that illuminated the neglected fields and empty corrals that had once thrived under old Thomas Morgan's careful stewardship. 3 years of drought, coupled with his father's passing last autumn, had left the ranch a shadow of its former glory. Caleb's weathered face, lined from years under the western sun, betrayed a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. At 45, after decades as a cattle driver and hired gun across the territories, he had returned too late to save his father, and perhaps too late to save the family legacy that stretched back to the first settlers in this valley after the war between the states. The ranch buildings sagged under the weight of neglect. The barn roof partially collapsed, and the cattle herd reduced to less than 30 head, barely enough to keep the creditors at bay for another season. Hey friends, if you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel and let me know which city you're watching from. Your support means everything. The sound of wagon wheels grinding against the dirt road pulled Caleb from his dark thoughts. He reached instinctively for the Colt revolver that hung at his hip, a habit formed during years of danger on the open range. Before recognizing Sheriff Bill Holloway's bay mare trotting alongside a covered wagon, the unexpected arrival of visitors was a rarity in this remote stretch of territory, especially this early in the season, when the mountain passes had just cleared of snow. The wagon drew closer, and Caleb could make out a slender figure in a dark blue traveling dress, seated beside the sheriff. His curiosity piqued, he descended the porch steps, boots crunching on the gravel as he moved to meet the approaching visitors. As they neared, Caleb removed his worn Stetson in a gesture of courtesy that his mother had instilled in him long before he'd become the hard man that years on the frontier had shaped. "Morning, Caleb," Sheriff Holloway called out, raising a hand in greeting. The lawman's familiar face, with its salt and pepper mustache and keen eyes, had aged considerably since Caleb had returned to Blackwater 6 months ago. "Brought someone you ought to meet." The wagon came to a stop, and Caleb got his first clear look at the woman seated beside the sheriff. She was younger than he expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with auburn hair tucked neatly beneath a practical bonnet. Her face bore the refined features of Eastern breeding, yet there was a determination in her green eyes that suggested she was no stranger to hardship. The sheriff helped her down from the wagon with surprising gentleness, and Caleb noticed she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the dust of travel that clung to her sensible dress. "This here is Mrs. Rebecca Taylor," Sheriff Holloway announced, guiding the woman forward. "Come all the way from Boston on yesterday's stage." The woman extended a gloved hand, which Caleb took awkwardly after wiping his palm against his worn denim pants. Her grip was firmer than he expected from a city woman, and her direct gaze unsettled him in a way gunfighters never had. "Mrs. Taylor," Caleb acknowledged, suddenly aware of his unshaven face and the sorry state of both himself and his property. He hadn't entertained visitors, let alone a lady, since returning to claim his inheritance. The discomfort of the moment left him searching for words that wouldn't come easily to a man accustomed to the company of cowboys and cattle. "Mr. Morgan," Rebecca replied, her voice carrying the refined accent of the East, but tempered with a warmth that seemed genuine. "Sheriff Holloway has told me about your ranch and your situation." She glanced around at the dilapidated buildings and overgrown fields with an appraising eye rather than judgment. "I've come in response to the advertisement." Caleb's brow furrowed in confusion until Sheriff Holloway cleared his throat awkwardly and pulled a folded newspaper clipping from his vest pocket. "This advertisement, Morgan," he explained, handing over the yellowed paper. "Your father placed it before he passed. Seems he was more concerned about the future of this place than you realized." Caleb unfolded the clipping with calloused fingers, his eyes widening as he read the carefully worded notice seeking a bride of good character and practical disposition for rancher in Montana Territory. The realization struck him like a physical blow. His father had attempted to secure the ranch's future in his absence. Sheriff Holloway shifted uncomfortably as understanding dawned on Caleb's weathered face. "Thomas placed it last summer when his health was failing," the lawman explained. "Asked me to handle the correspondence. Mrs. Taylor here was the only respondent who seemed suitable. Educated, recently widowed, no children to complicate matters." The sheriff lowered his voice. "Your father worried about what would happen to the place with you still wandering. Didn't expect to go before you returned, I reckon." Caleb felt the weight of his father's final efforts settle on his shoulders, alongside the burden of guilt he'd carried since returning too late to make amends with the old man. The years he'd spent away suddenly stretched before him like an accusation, while this stranger from Boston stood as a living reminder of his neglected responsibilities. Rebecca stepped forward, seemingly sensing the turmoil beneath Caleb's stoic exterior. "I understand this comes as a surprise, Mr. Morgan," she said quietly, her composure unwavering. "I was corresponding with your father for several months before his passing. When I received news of his death from Sheriff Holloway, I decided to honor our arrangement nonetheless." She gestured to the wagon where several trunks were secured beneath a canvas cover. "I've come prepared to work, not to burden you. My late husband left me with little besides debts, and I'm no stranger to difficult circumstances." The practicality in her tone matched the resolute set of her shoulders. "If you wish me to leave, I'll understand, though I'd ask for assistance in securing passage back east." Caleb studied the woman standing before him in the harsh morning light, trying to reconcile her presence with the chaotic state of his life and property. The ranch had been slowly dying around him as he struggled against his own inadequacies as a farmer rather than a cowhand. His skills with cattle and horses didn't extend to crops and repairs, and the winter had been long and isolating. The thought of sending away the only person who had shown interest in the ranch's survival seemed suddenly foolish, regardless of his father's presumptuous matchmaking from beyond the grave. "There's a spare room in the house," he said finally, gesturing toward the weathered two-story structure behind him. "It's not much, but it's clean. You're welcome to stay until you decide if this place is worth your effort." Relief flickered briefly across Rebecca's features before her composure returned. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan. I believe I'll find it more than adequate." She turned to Sheriff Holloway with a grateful nod. "Thank you for your escort, Sheriff. I can manage from here." The lawman looked between the two of them with barely concealed concern before tipping his hat. "I'll be checking in next week when I make my rounds," he said, the statement directed as much to Caleb as to Rebecca. "Mrs. Taylor's reputation is in my care until matters are settled properly." The implication was clear. The sheriff expected Caleb to behave honorably toward his unexpected guest. Caleb acknowledged the warning with a curt nod, already moving toward the wagon to retrieve Rebecca's trunks, as the sheriff mounted his horse and turned back toward town. The first week passed in awkward coexistence as Rebecca established herself in the Morgan household. Caleb watched with growing amazement as she transformed the long-neglected interior of the ranch house through sheer determination and countless hours of labor. She scrubbed floors that hadn't seen soap in years, repaired torn curtains, and organize the chaos that had accumulated since his mother's death a decade earlier. By the week's end, the kitchen gleamed with polished cookware, and meals appeared at regular hours. Simple fare, but prepared with skill that made Caleb realize how poorly he had been living. Each morning, she rose before dawn to manage the household, before turning her attention to the chicken coop she had insisted on rebuilding. Coaxing the few remaining hens into renewed production through careful tending and feed mixtures she prepared herself. Rebecca's practicality extended beyond domestic matters. Caleb discovered one morning, when he found her examining his father's ledgers at the kitchen table, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Your accounts are in disarray," she stated matter-of-factly, looking up as he entered with mud-caked boots from the morning's work with the cattle. "The bank in Helena holds a note against the property that will come due by harvest." There was no accusation in her tone, merely the same methodical approach she applied to every challenge she encountered. "I've worked out a schedule of necessary improvements and expenses." She pushed a neatly written list across the table. "If we're to save this ranch, we need to prioritize." The use of "we" wasn't lost on Caleb, who had spent decades answering to no one but himself. Yet he found himself studying her calculations with grudging respect, rather than the defensiveness that had characterized so much of his life. Caleb's skepticism began to fade as he observed Rebecca's tireless efforts and practical intelligence. By the third week, when Sheriff Holloway made his promised visit, the visible improvements to the property were substantial, enough to raise the lawman's eyebrows. The chicken coop bustled with activity. A vegetable garden had been marked out and planted near the house, and the sagging front porch had been reinforced with lumber Caleb had salvaged from an abandoned outbuilding. Inside, the sheriff found fresh bread on the table and coffee brewing on the stove, in a kitchen that bore little resemblance to the bachelor squalor he had witnessed on previous visits. "Seems you two are making progress," he commented, his gaze shifting between Rebecca's composed expression and Caleb's non-committal shrug. What remained unspoken was the obvious distance that still existed between landlord and tenant, for that was still the nature of their arrangement, despite Thomas Morgan's matrimonial intentions. The turning point came unexpectedly during the first spring storm, when torrential rain threatened the weakened barn, where the remaining livestock sheltered. Caleb had been working desperately to reinforce the structure when Rebecca appeared beside him in the downpour, wearing his father's old oilskin coat and carrying tools from the shed. Without waiting for instructions, she began hammering support braces into place alongside him, her movements efficient despite the unfamiliar labor. For hours, they worked in near silence, communicating through gestures and shared purpose, as light when the center beam finally gave way despite their efforts. It was Rebecca who pulled Caleb from the path of falling timber, both of them collapsing into the mud as a section of roof collapsed where he had stood moments before. "You could have been killed," Caleb gasped, rain streaming down his face as he stared at the woman who had just saved his life. Rebecca pushed wet strands of auburn hair from her face, her practical bonnet long since abandoned in the chaos. "So could you," she replied simply, rising to her feet and extending a hand to help him up. "We're not finished yet." Something shifted in Caleb's perception as he took her outstretched hand. This was not the delicate Eastern widow he had initially judged her to be, but a partner as formidable and determined as any man he'd ridden with on the frontier. Together, they worked through the night, salvaging what they could of the barn and ensuring the safety of the precious livestock that represented their hope for the ranch's future. By dawn, exhausted and mud-covered, they had accomplished what neither could have managed alone. The shared crisis eroded barriers that weeks of polite coexistence had failed to breach. Over a breakfast of coffee and biscuits, as sunlight began to dry the sodden landscape around the ranch house, Caleb found himself sharing stories of his years on the open range, tales he had told no one since returning to Blackwater. Rebecca listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking questions that revealed her growing knowledge of ranching operations. In turn, she spoke of her life in Boston, her marriage to a banker whose gambling debts had left her destitute after his death, and her decision to seek a new beginning in the West rather than accept the charity of disapproving relatives. "I came here seeking independence," she admitted, cradling her coffee cup in hands that now bore calluses alongside her wedding ring. "Your father's letter spoke of partnership, not charity." He was wiser than his son, Caleb acknowledged, the admission coming easier than he expected. "I spent years chasing freedom across every territory west of the Mississippi, only to return and find myself more trapped than ever." He gestured toward the window, where the damaged barn stood as testament to the challenges they faced. "This land demands more than one pair of hands can give." My father knew that. The conversation marked a shift from reluctant accommodation to genuine respect, laying groundwork for the cautious friendship that developed over the following weeks as they established a rhythm of shared labor and purpose. Rebecca never mentioned marriage or the original advertisement that had brought her to Montana, and Caleb found himself grateful for her discretion as they navigated their unexpected alliance. Spring advanced across the valley, bringing new growth to fields that Rebecca insisted on planting with vegetable crops alongside the traditional hay needed for winter feed. "Diversification," she explained, when Caleb questioned the wisdom of diverting resources from cattle. "Your father's ledgers show 3 consecutive years of cattle losses. We need alternative sources of income until the herd can be rebuilt." Her business acumen, cultivated during her marriage to a banker, proved as valuable as her willingness to work from sunrise to sunset alongside Caleb. When the general store owner in town offered credit for necessary supplies based on Rebecca's careful projections and payment plan, Caleb realized that her presence had already improved their standing in ways his own reputation could not have accomplished. The first true test of their partnership came with the arrival of Jacob Whitfield, the banker from Helena, who held the mortgage on the Morgan property. His unexpected visit, marked by the arrival of a polished carriage that seemed ludicrously out of place in the ranch yard, brought tension that had been absent in recent weeks. Whitfield made no attempt to hide his disdain as he surveyed the property, his fine suit and gold watch chain presenting a stark contrast to Caleb's worn work clothes. "Morgan," he acknowledged with barely disguised contempt, "I've come to discuss the terms of your loan. The payment date approaches. And based on my observations, I see little reason to expect you'll meet your obligations." The banker's calculating gaze shifted to Rebecca, who had emerged from the house at the sound of the carriage. "I wasn't aware you had acquired assistance." Before Caleb could respond with the anger rising in his chest, Rebecca stepped forward with the composed dignity that had impressed him from their first meeting. "Mr. Whitfield," she greeted the banker, extending her hand with the confidence of someone accustomed to business transactions. "Rebecca Taylor, Mr. Morgan's associate in this enterprise. Perhaps you'd care to inspect our improvements before discussing financial matters? We've made considerable progress since spring arrived." The unexpected formality of her approach momentarily disarmed the banker, who found himself being led on a tour of the property by a knowledgeable woman who spoke his language of assets, investments, and returns. Caleb followed in amazement as Rebecca highlighted the newly planted fields, the repaired outbuildings, and a carefully managed herd with its promising new calves. In the ranch house kitchen, Rebecca presented Whitfield with a detailed accounting of their operations, including projections for harvest yields and cattle sales that showed a modest but achievable path to meeting the mortgage payment. "As you can see," she concluded, her voice firm despite the banker's skeptical expression, "the Morgan Ranch is undergoing significant revitalization. We're requesting a 60-day extension on the upcoming payment to allow our first crops to be harvested and taken to market." Whitfield examined the figures with obvious reluctance before finally looking up at Caleb, who had remained uncharacteristically silent throughout the presentation. "Your father never mentioned a business partner, Morgan. What exactly is Mrs. Taylor's stake in this operation?" The question hung in the air, highlighting the undefined nature of their arrangement in a way neither had been forced to articulate before. Caleb felt Rebecca's gaze on him as he chose his words carefully. "Mrs. Taylor holds an equal interest in the ranch's future," he stated, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "My father recognized the need for her skills before his passing. I've since come to the same conclusion." The partial truth seemed to satisfy Whitfield, who closed the ledger with a snap. "Very well. 60 days, not a day more. But be advised, there are other parties interested in this land should you fail." The thinly veiled threat remained in the air after the banker's carriage disappeared down the road, reminding them both of the precarious nature of their situation. That evening, as twilight settled over the valley, Caleb found Rebecca on the newly repaired porch, her expression thoughtful as she gazed toward the distant mountains. "Thank you for what you said to Whitfield," she said without turning, "about my place here." Caleb leaned against the railing beside her, the day's tension gradually easing from his shoulders. "I only spoke the truth," he replied. "This ranch was dying before you arrived. The words came easier now than they would have even a month earlier. My father built something worth preserving here, and I nearly lost it through neglect and ignorance. You've given it a chance at survival." Rebecca turned to face him, her features softened in the fading light. "We've given it that chance, Mr. Morgan, together." The 60 days granted by Whitfield passed in a blur of relentless work as summer heat descended on the valley. Caleb found himself mastering agricultural skills he had previously disdained, guided by Rebecca's practical knowledge gleaned from books and correspondence with successful farmers back east. Together, they coaxed life from the neglected soil, tended the growing herd with meticulous care, and repaired infrastructure that had deteriorated through years of minimal maintenance. The barriers between them continued to erode through shared purpose and the quiet conversations that filled the evening hours after exhausting days of physical labor. Caleb discovered in Rebecca an unexpected confidant, someone who listened without judgment to the regrets and failures that had driven him from his father's ranch as a young man, while she gradually revealed the painful details of her marriage to a man whose charm had masked fatal flaws. As harvest approached, bringing with it the looming bank deadline, neighboring ranchers began to take notice of the transformation occurring at the Morgan property. Invitations arrived for community gatherings that Caleb had previously avoided, and Rebecca encouraged his reluctant participation. "Alliances matter in farming as much as in banking," she advised pragmatically. "We need to establish ourselves as part of this community, not outsiders." At the midsummer social held at the town church, Caleb watched with quiet pride as Rebecca conversed easily with the wives of established ranchers. Her knowledge and obvious dedication earning respect that would have been unthinkable for a newcomer under different circumstances. Later, as they drove home beneath a canopy of stars, the wagon loaded with gifts of preserve jars and promised seed exchanges, Caleb realized how thoroughly his life had been reordered by this woman who had arrived as a stranger just months before. The morning of the bank deadline dawned clear and hot, with the first wheat harvest completed and bundled for transport to the Helena market. Caleb loaded the wagon before sunrise. The proceeds of their summer labor, secured in crates alongside vegetables from Rebecca's thriving garden. "I'll return by nightfall," he promised, as Rebecca handed him a package of food for the journey. Her hand lingered on his arm, a gesture that had become familiar, yet still stirred something deeper than the partnership they had established. "Be careful," she said simply. "There's still much to do here." The weight of their shared investment, not just financial, but emotional, hung in the air between them, acknowledged but still undefined, as Caleb nodded and turned the wagon toward town. The future of the ranch balanced on the outcome of the day's business, along with whatever lay beyond for the unlikely partners who had found common purpose in its salvation. The journey to Helena passed in contemplative silence as Caleb reviewed the transformation of his circumstances since Rebecca's arrival. The ranch, that had seemed beyond salvation, now showed promising signs of renewal, with fields that would soon yield their second harvest of the season, and a cattle herd gradually increasing through careful management. More significant was his own transformation, from the aimless drifter who had returned to fulfill a reluctant duty to a man with purpose and investment in the future. The source of that change rode beside him in memory. Rebecca, kneeling in newly turned soil. Rebecca, bandaging a newborn calf's injured leg. Rebecca poring over accounts by lamplight with the same intensity he had once reserved for scanning horizons from horseback. The undefined nature of their relationship had become increasingly difficult to navigate, as mutual respect deepened into something neither had acknowledged directly. In Helena, the business of the day proceeded with unexpected ease. The harvest goods commanded fair prices at market, and Whitfield received the mortgage payment with poorly concealed surprise. "It seems your associate has had a positive influence on operations," the banker commented as he counted out the money and prepared a receipt. "Though I wonder how long a woman of her evident refinement will tolerate frontier conditions." The insinuation rankled Caleb more than he cared to admit. "Mrs. Taylor has adapted to Montana with remarkable success," he replied curtly, pocketing the receipt that represented their first victory against the ranch's precarious finances. "She's found purpose here that was lacking in her previous life." Whether the statement applied equally to himself remained unspoken as he concluded his business and prepared for the return journey, anxious to share their success with the architect of their financial strategy. The road back to Blackwater Valley seemed longer than the morning's journey, with Caleb pushing the team harder than was strictly necessary in his eagerness to return before darkness fell completely. The ranch appeared on the horizon, just as twilight painted the landscape in deepening shadows, the lamplight visible through the kitchen window serving as a beacon of welcome. As he guided the wagon into the yard, fatigue from the long day's journey melted away at the sight of Rebecca emerging from the house, her expression expectant in the gathering dusk. "It's done," he called out, holding up Whitfield's receipt as he set the brake and climbed down. "Paid in full, with enough left to see us through until the next harvest." The shared triumph of the moment deserved celebration, yet Caleb sensed immediately that something had changed during his absence. Rebecca's smile didn't reach her eyes, as she accepted the receipt and examined it briefly before folding it carefully into the pocket of her apron. "Well done, Mr. Morgan. You must be exhausted after such a journey." The formality in her tone, which had gradually disappeared over the months of their partnership, had returned like a wall between them. Caleb studied her face in the fading light, noting the strain around her eyes and the tight set of her mouth. "What's happened?" he asked directly, instinct warning him that something significant had occurred during his absence. Rebecca hesitated before gesturing toward the house. "Perhaps we should discuss it inside. You should eat something after your journey." The deflection only heightened Caleb's concern as he followed her into the kitchen, where a simple meal waited on the table. Only after they had settled at the table did Rebecca withdraw a letter from her pocket and place it carefully beside her plate. "This arrived by post rider this afternoon," she explained, her voice carefully controlled. "It's from my late husband's brother in Boston." She paused, seemingly gathering resolve before continuing. "It appears that some of my husband's investments have finally paid dividends. His brother has been pursuing the matter through legal channels and has secured what was rightfully mine. He's offering to send funds for my return passage to Boston, where apparently a position awaits me as companion to his elderly mother." The implications hung in the air between them. Financial independence, a return to civilization, release from the harsh demands of ranch life that had transformed her hands from those of a banker's wife to a working woman's callous tools. Caleb felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him, though he maintained an outward calm that belied the sudden hollow feeling in his chest. "I see," he said finally, when the silence had stretched uncomfortably between them. "That's fortunate news." The inadequacy of the response was painfully apparent, yet he found himself unable to articulate the complex emotions that surged beneath his carefully maintained exterior. "When would you leave?" The practical question emerged while deeper ones remained unasked. Was their partnership merely a temporary arrangement of necessity? Had the connection he felt growing between them been one-sided illusion? Rebecca's gaze dropped to the letter, her fingers tracing the elaborate letterhead absently. "He suggested the autumn stage, before mountain passes become difficult. That would give me time to—" she hesitated, "to ensure things here are properly organized." "Of course," Caleb nodded, the gesture mechanical as he struggled to process the implications. The ranch had begun to thrive under their joint efforts, but her departure would leave a void that extended far beyond the practical contributions she had made. Something essential would be lost, something he had only recently begun to recognize as vital to more than the ranch's survival. The meal continued in strained silence, each lost in private thoughts as the reality of impending separation cast a shadow over their shared accomplishment. Later, as Rebecca cleared the dishes with the efficiency that characterized all her movements, Caleb retreated to the porch where the vast Montana night sky had often provided clarity in moments of doubt. Tonight, however, the familiar constellations offered no guidance as he confronted the prospect of returning to solitude. The following weeks brought a subtle shift in the dynamics between them. The easy partnership that had developed through shared labor and purpose gave way to a more cautious interaction, with Rebecca focusing intently on documenting every aspect of the ranch operations for future reference, though neither acknowledged directly who might use such records after her departure. Caleb found himself increasingly restless, spending longer hours in the saddle checking boundary fences and grazing cattle, tasks that took him away from the ranch house, where Rebecca's imminent departure hung like an unspoken presence between them. The progress they had made together continued, with the second harvest proving even more successful than the first. But the shared satisfaction in their achievements was tempered by awareness of their limited future as partners. Sheriff Holloway's monthly visit brought the situation into sharper focus when he commented on the visible improvements to the property. "You two have worked miracles here," he observed, accepting a cup of coffee from Rebecca on the porch that now boasted new railings and a solid roof. Thomas would be proud to see his place thriving again. The compliment hung awkwardly as Rebecca and Caleb exchanged a glance that communicated the unspoken complication. The revival might be short-lived. Later, after Rebecca had returned to the house, the sheriff fixed Caleb with a penetrating look. "Heard about the letter from Boston," he said without preamble. "Word travels, even out here." When Caleb remained silent, the older man sighed. "Your father placed that advertisement for a reason, Morgan. He knew what this place needed, what you needed, though you're too stubborn to admit it." The conversation with Sheriff Holloway lingered in Caleb's thoughts as August heat gave way to the first cooling breezes of September. The stage that would carry Rebecca back to her former life would arrive in less than 3 weeks. Yet neither had spoken directly about the impending separation beyond practical arrangements for the ranch's continued operation. The distance between them had grown despite their physical proximity, with each retreating behind walls of practicality that protected against the vulnerability of honest conversation. It took an unexpected development to finally breach those walls. The arrival of Jacob Whitfield, unannounced and unwelcome, on a crisp morning when the first hints of autumn color touched the cottonwoods along the creek. The banker's carriage appeared as Caleb and Rebecca were working together to repair the chicken coop, a task that had prompted a rare moment of shared laughter when a particularly determined hen had escaped their efforts at containment. The sound of wheels on the approach road sobered them instantly, both recognizing Whitfield's conveyance before it reached the yard. "What does he want now?" Caleb muttered, setting aside his tools with a scowl. "A next payment isn't due for months." Rebecca straightened her apron and tucked stray hair back into place, automatically assuming the businesslike demeanor that had served them well in previous dealings with the banker. Together, they moved to meet the carriage as Whitfield pulled his team to a halt, his expression revealing nothing of his purpose as he descended with the aid of his driver. "Morgan, Mrs. Taylor." Whitfield acknowledged them with a curt nod. "I see you continue your improvements to the property." The observation carried no warmth, despite its accuracy. "I've come on a matter of some importance regarding the future of this land." He withdrew a document from his coat pocket, unfolding it with deliberate care. "I've received an inquiry and a substantial offer from Eastern investors interested in purchasing large tracts in this valley for a planned railway spur line. Your property, given its location and water access, is of particular interest." The revelation landed between them like a physical blow. "The offer is considerably more than the current market value," Whitfield continued, extending the document toward Caleb. "More than enough to clear your debts and establish yourself elsewhere, should you choose to accept." Caleb took the paper with reluctance, scanning the figures with growing disbelief. The sum was indeed substantial, enough to start fresh anywhere with no financial burden. A year ago, he might have grabbed such an opportunity without hesitation, eager to escape the responsibilities that had felt like shackles binding him to his father's legacy. Now, however, he found himself looking not at the paper, but at Rebecca, whose composed expression revealed nothing of her thoughts as she waited for his response. "I'll need time to consider this," he said finally, folding the document without further examination. Whitfield's eyebrows rose slightly at the lack of enthusiasm. "The offer stands for 2 weeks," he advised. "I should think the decision would be simple, given your circumstances." The glance he directed toward Rebecca made clear his awareness of her planned departure. After Whitfield's departure, an uncomfortable silence descended as they returned to their interrupted task. The banker's offer had forced to the surface questions that both had carefully avoided for weeks. "It's a generous amount," Rebecca observed finally, her voice carefully neutral as she handed Caleb a hammer. "More than enough for you to establish yourself wherever you choose." The statement hung in the air, an invitation to discuss possibilities neither had acknowledged. Caleb drove a nail with more force than necessary, splitting the wooden slat he had been securing. "Damn it," he muttered, tossing the hammer aside in frustration that had little to do with the damaged wood. "Is that what you think I should do? Sell my father's legacy to the highest bidder, now that it's finally worth something?" The challenge in his tone broke through Rebecca's careful composure. "I think," she replied with equal intensity, "that you have options now that didn't exist when I arrived. The ranch is viable again. You could sell and start fresh elsewhere, or stay and continue what we've begun. Either way, you're no longer trapped by your father's decisions or your own past." The distinction hung between them. What we've begun, and you're no longer trapped, highlighting the separate futures that loomed despite their shared present. Caleb faced her directly, abandoning pretense of work. "And what about you? Is Boston what you really want after all this?" The question he had avoided for weeks finally emerged, raw and direct. "Or is it just the easier choice than staying in a place that demands everything you have to give?" Rebecca's eyes flashed at the implied criticism. "I came here because I had no other options," she reminded him, her voice tight with emotion she rarely displayed. "I stayed and worked alongside you to honor an agreement made with your father. I've given months of my life to this land that wasn't mine, to a future I had no claim to. Now I have choices again, just as you do." The pain beneath her words was evident, despite her attempt at pragmatism. "We've accomplished what we set out to do. The ranch will survive now, with or without me." Caleb took a step closer, close enough to see the pulse beating rapidly at her throat, despite her outward composure. "Is that what you believe? That you have no claim here? That what we've built together means nothing beyond a business arrangement?" "What else could it be?" Rebecca challenged, holding her ground despite his proximity. "Your father arranged for a practical partnership, not—" She faltered, unwilling to name the connection that had grown between them despite the circumstances of her arrival. "You never asked me to stay, Caleb. Not once in all these months." The use of his given name, rare despite their daily proximity, underscored the significance of the moment. "You accepted my help when you needed it, but you've never indicated that you wanted anything more permanent than that." The accusation carried the weight of weeks of unspoken tension, of moments when connection might have deepened into commitment, had either found the courage to bridge the final distance between them. "Why would I stay where I'm merely useful rather than essential?" The question struck at the heart of Caleb's carefully maintained reserve, the protective distance he had cultivated through years of solitary existence. "You think you are not essential?" he demanded, gesturing toward the thriving ranch around them. "Look at what we've created together. I couldn't have saved this place alone. My father knew that, even if I was too stubborn to admit it." The admission cost him pride accumulated through decades of self-reliance. Yet the words flowed with surprising ease now that the barrier of silence had broken. "This ranch was dying without your hands to help rebuild it. But it's more than that. He drew a deep breath, crossing the final boundary into vulnerability that had seemed insurmountable for so long. I was dying too, not just failing at ranching, but failing at living anything beyond mere existence. You brought purpose back to this land, and to me with it. Rebecca's carefully maintained composure wavered at his words, her eyes brightening with unshed tears. "Then why let me leave?" she whispered, the question hanging between them like the last barrier to truth. "Why say nothing while I plan my departure?" Caleb closed the remaining distance between them, his calloused hands taking hers with a gentleness that belied their strength. "Because I couldn't ask you to stay out of obligation," he admitted. "Not when Boston offers you comfort and security that I can't guarantee. Not when I've watched you work yourself to exhaustion for a place that holds no legal claim on you. You deserve better than an uncertain future tied to a stubborn old cowboy and a piece of land that will always demand more than it gives." The self-deprecation couldn't mask the deeper truth evident in his voice, that he wanted her to choose to stay, not from necessity, but from the same powerful connection he had finally acknowledged to himself. "I've had comfort and security before," Rebecca replied softly, her hands remaining in his despite the tremor that ran through them. "My marriage offered both, yet left me empty inside, a decorative object in someone else's life." Her gaze held his with new directness, the careful distance of recent weeks dissolving in the honesty of the moment. "Here, I found purpose, yes, work that matters and the satisfaction of seeing it bear fruit. But I also found a partner who values what I bring beyond my dowry or social connections." Her voice strengthened with conviction as she continued. "I don't want to return to Boston, Caleb. I never did. But I couldn't stay where I might never be more than your father's final business arrangement, a convenient solution to the ranch's problems, rather than a woman you chose for herself." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable, in a way their practical partnership had never required. Caleb's weathered face softened as understanding dawned. They had been circling the same unspoken truth, each unwilling to risk rejection by claiming more than their arrangement specified. "Rebecca," he said finally, her name carrying weight he had never allowed it before. "This ranch was dying without a woman's hands to help restore it. That's the truth. But it's only half of what I've discovered these past months." His hands tightened gently around hers, anchoring them both in the moment of revelation. "The other half is that I was dying too, not just failing at ranching, but failing at living. Only your presence, your partnership, your—" he hesitated before committing to the word. "Your love could keep it alive. Keep me alive." The distance between them vanished as Rebecca closed the final gap, her response more eloquent than words, as months of careful restraint yielded to the truth they had both been avoiding. The kiss was tentative at first, then deepening with the certainty of recognition. This connection had been growing since that first spring storm when they had saved the barn together, each discovering in the other a strength and commitment that matched their own. When they finally drew apart, the world around them seemed changed. The same ranch buildings and fields, but transformed by the acknowledgement of what had been building between them all along. "I won't sell," Caleb said with quiet certainty. "Not to Whitfield or anyone else. This is our place now, if you'll stay and build it with me. Not as my father's arrangement, but as my wife." Rebecca's smile held the warmth that had been absent since the letter from Boston arrived. "Yes, she said simply, the single word carrying more certainty than all the practical plans they had made together. I'll stay. The promise hung in the clear Montana air as the sun crested overhead, illuminating the ranch that had been transformed through their joint efforts, a transformation that now extended to their futures as well. What had begun as a desperate arrangement had grown into something neither had expected to find in the harsh landscape of the Montana frontier. Partnership deeper than business, connection stronger than convenience, and love born of shared purpose rather than social convention. The ranch that had been dying without a woman's hands would now thrive under their combined care, a legacy renewed not just through labor, but through the commitment that had grown between two people who had found each other against all odds. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.